തുറക്കണേ ദേവാ, നേരെന്റെ പാത തുറക്കണേ ദേവാ, കാണായ ലോകങ്ങൾ കാക്കുന്ന ദേവാ. ആചാര്യ അനുസ്മരണം. ആചാര്യ നിൻ പാദം പണിയുന്നു ഞങ്ങൾ, ആ ദിവ്യ സന്ദേശം പകരുന്നു ഞങ്ങൾ. ആചാര്യ നിൻ പാദം പണിയുന്നു ഞങ്ങൾ, ആ ദിവ്യ സന്ദേശം പകരുന്നു ഞങ്ങൾ. ഗോഖലെ കാട്ടിയ ശൈലയിൽ നീ രക്ഷാമേഖല സൃഷ്ടിച്ചിനായ സംഘം. ഗോഖലെ കാട്ടിയ ശൈലയിൽ നീ രക്ഷാമേഖല സൃഷ്ടിച്ചിനായ സംഘം.
Now let us invite our beloved Head of the Department of English, Dr. J. Anjana Ma'am of NSS College, Pandalam, to offer the felicitation about this webinar series. Now, please.
Thank you, Google. Respected Principal in absentia, the resource person of the day, Dr. Hufaiz, Dr. K.J. Gumar, convener, IUST of the college, my dear colleagues and all the participants who had assembled here, a very warm good morning to one and all. The Department of English, NSS College Pandalam, is back with its webinar series titled Literature in the New World. This is our 6th edition in this series. Today we are having an erudite scholar and a brilliant academician as our resource person. I extend our sincere thanks to you, sir, for having accepted our invitation. I think this is going to be a happy confluence of the extreme north and the extreme south of India. We are looking forward to your illuminating and refreshing session ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I'm really honored to introduce the speaker of this webinar, Assistant Professor Dr. Huzaifa Pandit of the Islamic University of Science and Technology, Awantipura, Kashmir. You may also know him as the author of the book Green is the Color of Memory, which won the first edition of Rhythm Divine Poets Chapbook Contest 2017. So please do the honors with your invite.
Are we starting?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, sir. Now the session is all yours.
Okay, give me a second. Shambhu, should I play the PDF?
I have sent the PP2 to one of our lecturers. He is trying. Could you please wait for a moment? So
Sure,
let's see if we
sure.
can run it as a PPT itself. Otherwise, we'll go with the PDF in a moment.
All right. Yeah, now it's playing full screen. Earlier
Yeah,
it was
I
playing
think the problem has been resolved.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So we are good to begin.
Right. Just let me put this on. Okay. Good morning to everyone. It's a cold morning in Kashmir, and I don't know how the weather is in Kerala, but it's quite cold here. And nonetheless, I'm quite glad and happy to see you all here. Thank you, Shambhu, for inviting me, and thank you, ma'am, the department, for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. The topic I'm going to talk about today is resistance poetry and Agha Shahid Ali, which I worked on primarily for my PhD. My PhD was on resistance poetry. My aim is to primarily point out to you, what resistance poetry, the term is, and to point out that how we have sort of reduced the scope of resistance poetry and why we need to reimagine this concept of resistance poetry. And also, my idea is to look at the reception of Agha Shahid Ali. Now, Agha Shahid Ali was a fantastic poet. There is no second guessing that. Neither am I going to challenge that notion that he is a fantastic poet. My assertion is rather different. What I'm trying to prove to you or point out is that we may not have looked at Agha Shahid Ali, as when we, especially in Kashmir and in South Asia, I've seen Agha Shahid Ali when I, started my research on him. I found out there are primarily two ways that Shahid is looked at. One is that as an Indian poet, who introduced a lot of Basha literature, who introduced a lot of the East into, the Western canon, and sort of experimented with strict formalistic genres like the canon zone and the ghazal. And in the Kashmir, in Kashmir and other areas, he is venerated as this major resistance poet who brought Kashmir's issues to the fore. So we tend to focus a lot on country without the post office. My point is to not question that Shahid represented Kashmir. My point is to show that, Shahid's class origins and Shahid needs to be examined in a much more deeper and complex way than we have looked at. And that I link to this whole idea of resistance poetry, that how does Shahid's poetry lead to a revised definition of resistance poetry, which is not the way we have traditionally understood resistance poetry, or as the foundational texts of resistance poetry have told us. We rely a lot on Western theorists. And since Barbara Harlow came up with this definition of resistance poetry, it has been quoted, I have seen it quoted endlessly and without any qualifiers. So my point is to show to you that how we need to qualify the application of this term and not accept the academia's definition of resistance poetry. So without much ado, can you please move to the first slide? Thank you. So the term resistance literature, unlike what a lot of people, students who come into, English, think that everything comes to us from the West. We study literary theory, we study literary criticism. Hardly do we look at anything that comes from the East. We immediately start with the Greeks, the Romans, so on, Romantics, and so on and so forth. But the term resistance literature, I'm glad to say, has not originated in the West, but in the very East, in Palestine, to be exact. Okay? And who coined it? It was coined by the Palestinian novelist and activist Ghassan Kanafani, who wanted to differentiate between the literature of exile, which is al-Ittihal, and a literature which is caused by forced exile. Now, you know what migration is. There was this term, Ejaz Ahmed called it migrations of privilege. You can migrate, a lot of people migrate to the Gulf, to the US, to Europe for want of better opportunities. Is that the same migration as someone who is displaced from his original homeland? Say, for example, the Kashmiri Pandits. Okay, so it's not the same. Okay, so what we need to see is then that he could ask for a difference between the two. One is literature of exile, al-Ittihal. He said there's a literature. Now, even if people are not exiled per se from the land, but they can still live in exile. I mean, they might not have representation. They might not have any participation in the political processes, or they may be, kept in perpetual subjugation. That must also be understood as a kind of exile. So one is, what is the experience, lived experience, was the experience of exile of those people. He said we need to coin a lived literature for that. So he called that al-manfa, which translates into Western literature. And then he proposed a very important criterion. He said that the occupier must actually intervene in the cultural production. Now, you must know from your study of literature, if you're a postgraduate, you must know what is called an ideological state apparatus. Okay? No power can exist without it legitimizing itself. It is not possible for power to exist solely by coercion. It's not possible. That's why you have advertisements. That's why you have bans on books or films being made. That's why the whole culture industry, quote unquote, exists. Because you need to legitimize a narrative. No narrative can be shoved down the throat of the people. You can show it down by a gunpoint, but it will meet with resistance. For people to accept it, it must be legitimized. So therefore, what the occupier does is, in Kanafani's case, he says the occupier or the subjugator must actively intervene in the cultural production. So that's why when Israel attacked Palestine, Lebanon, the first thing they did when they attacked Lebanon was the destruction of PLA. Palestinian Liberation Activism Organization, PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. They attacked the office and destroyed all archives. Right? And must try to create new narratives that legitimize its existence. So, in other words, what the occupier does is it appropriates the uh, existing narratives and puts a new spin to them to suit its interests. So, literature then emerges as a site of contest. Is somewhere, where a place wherein you keep fighting. You fight this imposition. It is where you express lived realities of struggle, okay, and alienation in an environment wherein one side is basically trying to erase your memory. You are faced a situation which is completely inimical to your existence. You are being cleansed, you are being murdered, you are being arrested, or somewhere on the line you might not gel well with the population, or if you have been exiled. So in such a case, when you have to express lived realities, so the state is seeking to censor, and you are trying to reiterate your views, all right, reiterate your lived realities. That's where literature emerges. So literature emerges basically as a site of contest, okay, and resistance poetry essentially draws from the same impulse of defiance. It's a defying of the authority, the censoring gaze of the state. And since poetry is oral, since you do not need poetry to be written, you can remember poetry, you can recite poetry, you can narrate poetry. That's why the earliest tradition of literature comes from poetry. Okay? And poetry can be circulated from heart to heart. You don't need to have it written. And you cannot check what is inside a person's memory. There does, you can't X-ray it or CT scan it for that. So it is safe in the heart and minds of people. And therefore, when you narrate that poetry, it mobilizes a, collective, uh, collective memory. Can you go back? Yes. All right. And, it mobilizes a collective response, this occupation, by contesting the legitimacy. And therefore, it seeks to reclaim the control of the subjugated over their collective historical memory, what the state seeks to erode. Can you bring me on, please? Yes. Now you might ask, but what is it important? Why is it important to reclaim the control over memory? Why should we write down this memory? After all, people do remember, people will not forget. Why should we struggle so much to reclaim this memory? You cannot reclaim the land, you cannot reclaim power, but why do you fight for reclaiming this control? Because if you reclaim the memory, then you reclaim identity, you reclaim existence. Why? Because when you are controlled, when your memory is controlled, then don't have the power to name. And if you don't have the power to name, then your whole subjecthood, your whole subjectivity is determined accordingly. Right? So, in other words, the struggle is because the subjugated do not depend upon the subjugator. The lamb does not depend upon the wolf to tell it whether its forefather or whether its father killed it, hurled abuses at it. It's the lamb's own recollection of the story. Right? And draw their identity, and therefore their identity is shaped by a collective belief in a shared identity and shared land. So when we talk about Kashmir particularly, or in other, Palestine, or say any other siege need not be necessary militarily. You can have siege as a cultural siege too. So I was talking about, since I've been talking about Agha Shahid Ali. So when Shahid talks about, poetry, it's a commencement of a Kashmiri genesis. It subverts the erasure of memory of an entire people. So why are we investing? Why do I write or why do others write? Because the memory is endangered. 50 years down the line, 60 years down the line, who is going to remember what happened here? So the looming threat of an entire culture and people. Say, for example, if you look at the map of Palestine and Israel, you'll see, for example, how gradually all the Palestinian things like hummus or the literally simple things like the food has been appropriated. So resistance therefore becomes not just a question of a political question, it becomes an existential question rather than remaining restricted to an opposition against military subjugation, and thus mourns the march of ruinous time, in which Kashmir has or any other place becomes a simmering cauldron of despair, resignation, and uncertainty. So, therefore, poetry becomes a commemorative function. Poetry performs a commemorative function. It does not just record, it commemorates what has been lost. Why has it been lost? Who has been lost? Alright? And therefore, at the same time, when you're chronicling the micro histories, it becomes a defiance of the erasure of local histories, because you are not in the power to establish, in power to prescribe syllabi or to write histories or to speak. Therefore, when histories are censored, poetry provides a blueprint of the semiotics of everyday subvergence and gestures of dissent. So the way you live every day, the way I talk, the way I eat, in itself becomes resistance. Right? So in that sense, well, as all poetry is to some degree an account of lived experience, because you cannot produce literature out of a hat. Right? You need to live it to be able to write it. Even if you imagine it, you can only imagine what you must have seen or perceived. To some degree, every literature is an account of a lived experience, is the very livelihood, lifeblood, and prominent marker of resistance poetry. Could we move on, please? All right. Now that I've talked about the function of resistance poetry, the other part remains the aesthetic of resistance poetry. Now, resistance poetry was made popular, the term was made popular by Barbara Harlow. Excuse me. A professor at University of Buffalo who wrote this very influential book called Resistance Literature. In her book, she claims that resistance poetry is, anti-metaphorical. What does she mean? Anti-metaphorical. She means that, it is somewhere, something which does not use metaphors, which does not rely on the notions of beauty or the relations of music. Okay? But rather is very plain. She says such poetry is devoid of ornamentation, which refuses conformity to the romantic ideal of inspiration and composition. Why? Because it's neither concerned with pleasure. As the Wordsworthian famous definition is, poetry is the recollection of poetry is the overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. Right? And she says that such poetry is neither written in tranquility, neither does it give any pleasure. The heart does not dance with the daffodils. In fact, if anything, the heart weeps with the people who are died. Right? So she thinks it's like what Neruda said. They asked me, why does your poetry have nothing of the volcanoes, the mangoes, and volcanoes and olives? And what does he say? Come and see the blood on the streets. Come and see the blood on the streets, and come and see the blood on the streets. So this poetry is not composed in solitude. Right? It's not that there are beautiful. Yes, Kashmir is paradisical, quote unquote. It's very beautiful. It has beautiful gardens, but it's not poetry that is written in a garden. It's not poetry that is written when I am free. It's poetry that comes in crisis and tumult, and often composed in the battlefield. That's what Barbara Harlow says, to commemorate the fallen and defeated. So, a famous example she gives is of this Baloch poet who tells the wife of a comrade, I have no way else to say but this: your husband has fallen, to save the rocks of this land. So it might not look poetry in the first sense at all. So the process of poetic production then moves back to the original debate on the function of literature. Is literature to be pleasure, literature for art's sake, or art for life's sake? Resistance poetry, she points out, is mainly towards art for life's sake, the Marxistian idea also of art for the sake of activism. I mean, and even if it can provide pleasure in its own right by its formal finish, you have Darvish, you have Faz, you have so many poets, Agha Shaidali, who have written formal, formally, but its aesthetic is basically the aesthetic of subversion and transgression. So that means it takes on a clear ideological position. It does not hide behind neutrality. It's not something written about love. It's not something written about, you know, gardens and, beautiful trees or daffodils. It takes clear-cut positions. So poetry then is a vehicle of protest, and this protest, when you think of protest as a direct and vocal opposition to the narratives of the state, or to the narratives of the occupier, or the narratives of the subjugator. So it is presumed that resistance poetry must draw on this vocabulary of confrontation. That is, if the state says, you all go left, poetry should say, you all go right. We think of resistance poetry as that. Okay? And we think that it must narrate it faithfully. It must say clearly, outline the slogans. Okay? And try to preserve some modicum of form or best symbol. Okay? But this is not the truth. Resistance poetry is, after all, poetry. It is not a slogan. You can have politician can give a slogan. A historian can write history much better. A political scientist can theorize about politics much better. Why then should we write poetry? What is the fun of writing poetry? What is the fun of, publishing books or making films? So it can achieve effect only, not only it can achieve major effect when it conforms to the requirement of expressivity and multiplicity of meaning. What Ghalib called mani afrini, that is multiple meanings, multiplicity. So when you think of Agha Shahid Ali's poetry in, say, for example, Half Inch Himalayas, or you say Country Without the Post Office, this is the definition of Faz, for that matter, or Darvish, post his Lebanon. When you see Darvish post as Oslo Accords, post 1993, say, why did you leave the horse alone? Or we come from there. Yeah? That poetry must be understood as offering an insight into poetry's refusal to offer a singular way of thinking and imagining the nation. Now, this is crucial. We think that poetry must be nationalistic. Resistance poetry must be nationalistic. Resistance poetry is not nationalistic. It does not say make a nation like this or make a nation like that. Rather, what it understands is that a nation is made of multiple and conflicting ideas. This nation is thought of, when you think of a nation, if you try to impose a singular identity or a singular way of thinking, or a counter to it, when you impose a counter to the nation, when you say, okay, the state is wrong, this is right, that will, if you try to express this idea through poetry, it will not work. Right? What it offers you, resistance poetry, is a vision of a counter movement that cannot be plotted along a single idea. It offers varied and intersecting models of a nation, which refuses to be understood as a single idea. Now, can we move on to the next slide, please? Yes. Now, the question then is, how does Shahid's poetry emerge as a paradigm of this revised definition? Okay. So, one of the ways, Shahid has been misinterpreted is that we think of Shahid's poetry as embodying a dualistic role. So, one is half-inch Himalayas, nostalgia for the lost home. Then we have country without the post office, oh, a longing for a home, injured. Okay, these are the two ways in which you think of Shahid. Now, my point is that if you look at Shahid this way, what you are missing out is that there are contradictory longings in Shahid that resist a binarizing and totalizing approach to imagining the nation Kashmir or India. Right? It cannot be traced along the binary of oppressor, victim, assailant, and therefore it points out to you that you must necessarily remap Kashmiri identity in historical space and time. That is, you must necessarily see that Kashmir cannot be thought of only as, for example, a Sunni nation. You must necessarily ought to think of Kashmir only as belonging to, say, a Hindu nation. You must necessarily understand Kashmir's identity as formed from multiple, strands. So why does this binary need to be dismantled? Because it's the replication of the way the state functions, which marks the binaries of acceptability and non-acceptability. All right, and it says this is where you can go, this is where you cannot go. These spaces are opaque since the general Kashmiri population is not permitted to either access them or informed about these spaces. I mean, so, and also because poetry is able to conflate geographies and times. You can talk about the Nile in Kashmir, for example, Nile, which is in Egypt, as Shahid does. For example, he imagines Kashmir by the Hudson. Okay. So, since it conflicts geographies and times, the contradictions and contests in the text become an articulation not of a fixed nation state, but a vehicle of potentialities. That is, it shows you that poetry must necessarily be understood as embodying various potential meanings, which might sometimes even be in conflict with each other. But that's the very beauty of it, that it becomes a disruptive and transformative space where divergent ideas, where an idea which is necessarily opposed to each other, they can exist together in the same space. So, therefore, it can be employed to generate a greater mutuality and inclusiveness. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Now I'll point out to you how there is contradiction in Shahid, which was supposed to be the main point of my topic. So if you look at Country Without a Post Office, which is the title poem, the argument is actually quite detailed. I'll just give you a brief 2-3 examples so as to show you what I meant by contradictions in Shahid. So you have Pastoral, which is the first poem of the book, and the image, that are found in country without a post office: the desolate homes, fire, lamps being lit, smoke, the undelivered letters, the maps and the mirror, saffron and soaked blood, and the sounds, the call for prayer, calling out for people who are lost. For example, it says, it's us. And the protagonist, the muezzin, the person who gives the Muslim call for prayer, adhan, the soldiers, and the estranged friend who is now a refugee, and the speaker who has returned from exile. These are all present in Country Without a Post Office. I mean, the poem. Although these images will recur throughout Shahid's poetry, especially the book Country Without a Post Office. If you look at Country Without a Post Office and try to find the what you would call LCM, lowest common multiples, and see what are the motifs that keep recurring, these are absolutely the motifs that will keep recurring. But in this poem, he makes an interesting addition to this. He adds a paisley. And right, he talks about, I have brought in a currency of paisleys with blank envelopes. Right? That's the line he quotes. My point is, what is a paisley? Now you might have seen, if you don't know what a paisley is, I'll show you what a paisley is here. Uh, can I just for a moment show, you know, yes, here. This is paisley. Right? This is what you call this inverted. This image is what's called a paisley. Thank you. Right. Yes. Could you pull this, please? Play this again. Okay. I'm not able to see fully. Like, can the others see the slide? Okay, I'll move on. Okay, so a paisley is a motif shaped like an upturned teardrop with a curved upper end, and sometimes thought to represent an almond or blossom. And this is a common motif on a Kashmiri shawl. Alright? Now, Kashmiri shawls were quite popular. Why is the Kashmiri shawl important? One, because during colonization, Kashmiri shawls became the rage in Europe. Alright? It was a luxury item. Even today, for example, when a tourist will come to Kashmir, they'll try to find out the shawls and the carpets, the handicrafts of Kashmir. Now, this shawl became a typical symbol of Oriental luxury. Right? It became a typical symbol of Oriental luxury, and therefore it represents the Oriental gaze, first and foremost. Has the slide stopped showing? Has the slide stopped showing?
Yes, sir. Please wait just 1 second.
Okay. Right. So what's pointing is that the shawl represents is a symbol of Oriental luxury, and it was the way the Orient was shown as, fantastic and exotic. Number one. So it represents since the motif paisley is a symbol of femininity, so it becomes a symbol of the Oriental gaze. Now you remember the Oriental gaze makes the Occident makes the Orient effeminate, right? Symbolic castration of the Orient. So one, it is that. So it associates Kashmir with a passive mother, a beloved who is in need of rescue. And Shahid once he intervenes to perform this messianic role. I mean, now he is the colonizer, he is just like the colonizers. the Occident places itself as a rescuer of the brown woman or the brown people, okay, who are in need of intervention, who are barbaric or who are being subjugated by their local tyrants and must be rescued from these local tyrants. Therefore, Shahid mirrors the same role when he writes about bringing in a currency of paisleys. So, what's he pointing out? The passive Kashmir transforms into a mother who is in need of his assistance. Right? But more importantly, when Shahid offers cash, a currency of paisley, to buy new stamps, they are already blank, no nation after them. Why? Because he wants to bribe his way to find a correspondent who has been lost in the tumult of Kashmir. Now you must remember Shahid's context here. Shahid is talking about 1990s Kashmir when militancy was at its peak and there was a state of whole chaos and lawlessness. The post offices were shut, every sort of administration was in complete disarray. That's when he is talking about, and he has come from abroad to find a local correspondent who was his friend who has gone missing. And this poem is addressed to him. And he says, I have brought new stamps. We are already blank, no nation after them. In order to what? To bribe my way to find the lost correspondent. Now, when Shahid says that I have to bribe my way through to find the correspondent, I'll pay people to find my lost correspondent. So, what he's pointing out is that there is a commerce of subjugation. Now you know how the police and how local law apparatus work. Right? We had this film recently, for example, that caused a lot of controversy. Jai Bhim. Like the very first scene, you see how many exchange hands. So any form of subjugation, there will be corruption, there will be commerce. Right? So there is a well-oiled machinery of extortion that exists. And he's more specifically talking about the Ikhwan. The Ikhwan were an extra military force that were raised to counter militancy, and they ran a very well-oiled extortion network. They lived by kidnapping and extorting people, and it became such a torment that one of the first things Nick's government did was to dismantle them. But the trauma that the Ikhwan has left, still you can find in Kashmir. There's still there are cases against them, and they still exert. The very name makes people shiver. Okay? But at the same time, when he's talking about Paisley, why Paisley? He could talk about anything else. Now, when Paisley evokes shawl, he is also evoking the 1847 Treaty of Amritsar, by which Jammu and Kashmir, the state that used to exist, now it's a union territory, Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, as it used to exist pre-2019, the state was created only in 1847. It did not exist before that. Kashmir was separate, Jammu was separate, Ladakh was separate. Okay? So the whole area came into existence only in 1847 after the British, won with the Sikhs. I think the second Anglo-Sikh War, or the first Anglo-Sikh War. And it was sold to Maharaja Gulab Singh in lieu of 75 lakh rupees Nanak Shahi, which is less than your 1 rupee. 1 Nanak Shahi rupee was 0.75 paisa. That means Kashmir was sold for a total of lock, stock, and barrel. Its people, its land, its rivers, its mountains, everything contained in Kashmir was sold by the British to the Dogra ruler for 75 lakh rupees. But two conditions were there. One, he had to recognize the British supremacy, and the gifts, among the gifts included were that the Maharaja had to give 3 pairs of Kashmiri shawls, right? Some goats and Kashmiri shawls. Now, Kashmiri shawls, therefore, have a symbolic, importance in the history of Kashmir, because they represent the way Kashmir was sold off without the will of its people, without asking them, and nowhere in the history of people history of the world had such a transaction, legal transaction taken place. Sure, people had been sold into slavery. Sure, people were, sold off without their will, but never in the history of the world had such a deal existed before that. That the whole land, whole area of people were sold for 75 lakh rupees without asking them. So, what Shahid is pointing out is its role in colonial imaginaries. So, by underscoring obtaining of news and recovery only after payment of paisley, the poem invokes the material dimension of subjugation and the complicity of the elite Muslim class in perpetuating it. Now, what do I mean by, can we move on? By the elite Muslim class in perpetuating it. Now remember that, just as when India was under British rule, okay, British rule could not exist in India without, locals helping it. For example, the Rajas, the Maharajas, and the others, the elite people, they all sided with the British. So, therefore, what he's pointing out is when Shahid established himself as someone who is able to pay his way. Okay, so what is he showing here? He is pointing out the complicity of the elite Muslim class in perpetuating subjugation of Kashmir. Okay, so when the speaker can afford to purchase new rare stamps with paisley, he has currency. And when he has said all other stamps are cancelled and the post offices are dead, so that means it is a privilege. He can buy things when nobody has any money. He can buy currency or paisley, and the stamps are the stamps of blank. You can write something on them. You can send them to somewhere. Now, where do you get stamps? You get stamps from a post office. But the post offices, he says, are already dead. So therefore, he has privilege because he has some money with him. So what this privilege mirrors is the privilege enjoyed historically by the elite Muslim class in Kashmir. I mean, in a country when the common Muslims face extreme deprivation and extreme poverty and no access to education. I'm talking about the Dogra rule. All right, and before that, elite Muslim families like Naqshbandis and Aghas during the Afghan Sikh and Dogra rule bucked this trend. For example, Shahid's forefathers enjoyed great access to the court. When the ordinary person could not even dream of talking to a revenue official, could not even talk to a revenue patwari, let alone go to all the way to a Maharaja. Now, his forefathers not only had access to the court, but they were important officials as royal physicians and important police functionaries. And his father also worked in various capacities in the state administrator, retiring as commissioner secretary of education. Despite being appointed by Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, and even when Sheikh Abdullah was disposed of, Agha, his father, was not disposed of. His father still kept being promoted. So he was able to shift his loyalties very well from one regime to other. So what I'm pointing out is that the Agha family had sprawling jagirs, including Ismawar jagirs, which were retained for the lifetime, and Haki Asmi jagirs, which were permanent hereditary. That is one jagir which was during the lifetime, and others which were permanent, which transferred from son to son. For example, they had 500 canals in Mujgund and 120 canals at Nawabi Bagh, Bhagwanpura, Srinagar, which would even then come in lakhs, let alone today with crores. In an interview, Agha Ashraf Ali, that's the father of Agha Shahid Ali, supplied evidence of this privilege, and he said at his peak, my grandfather was making 2,500 rupees a month. This at a time when you could get in Kashmir 65 large breads for a single rupee. That was what the rupee value was, which was the average teacher's salary at the time. So his teacher earned the salary of grandfather earned the salary of 2,500 teachers at the same time. Okay. So what I'm pointing out is another example you can see if you look at the if you take a look at the Shahs, all right, the Naqshbandis, uh, you know, you can look at, for example, you know, Naqshbandis. They had Jagis worth rupees 2,500. And even if they lost a significant portion of it to the Dogra states, they had the privilege to administer several shrines in Srinagar, particularly the shrine of Khwaja Naqshband Sahab, and the considerable financial resources because people donated that came to them. Similarly, the Shawls enjoyed ownership of lands, orchards, and houses spread over Kashmir. This is quoted by Chitralekha Zutshi in her book. So, similarly, when you see Anjuman Nusratul Islam, that established the first school for Muslims in the valley in 1898, when it was founded to work for the cause of education of Kashmiri Muslims, its sphere was limited and remained restricted to the elite Muslims only. All right, and remained around only Srinagar, which was one of the smallest regions of Kashmir. Kashmir is not just Srinagar, there are other districts too. All right, and out of the 600 contributors to the school, only 20 were from outside Srinagar, and the classes were held in Persian and Urdu, which were both languages of elites, neither of which could be spoken or understood by the other classes. So when Shahid is bringing in Paisley and saying, I have this privilege he recognizes is his historical privilege. It's the privilege that the Agha family has enjoyed historically. And Shahid is reiterating that privilege because of the way he can intervene with the administration. He can intervene in the larger structures of power. So the position of Paisley currency is a rearticulation of immunity from the routine deprivation and violence of colonialism by virtue of location and class. So it mirrors the return of its predecessors, though this time is not in service of the state but against it. Also look at what the pastoral, the location of peace, when he says, we shall meet by the gates of Srinagar, when the soldiers return us the keys. And when you see where do the soldiers return the keys, and the image given of this temple, of this, area, you know, is a large pastoral, is a large colonial style villa with a large garden and which is amply furnished, as you can see by the stand. Now, Cedar was not, a very cheap, it's not even cheap now, let alone then. Okay? So when he's speaking of a large garden and amply furnished at that, it is a reiteration of his class imagination that even in his mind, a location of peace can only be a colonial style villa. Okay? Can we move on to the next slide, please? The next slide. The next slide, yes. In Return to Harmony 3, for example, Shahid outlines the cultural and traditional capital of his family. For example, he says, the Quran still protects the house, lying strangely wrapped in a jamwa shawl. Italics are mine for emphasis, where my mother had left it on the walnut table by the fireplace. I pick up the dead phone on my shelf by Ritos and Raiki and Kavafi and Lorca and Iqbal and Amichai and Paz. My parents are beautiful in their wedding brocades, so startlingly young. Now, Jamwa shawl is one of the most expensive shawls you can, dream of having. It's quite beyond an ordinary man to have a Jamwa shawl if it still can be bought anywhere. It will cost anywhere in lakhs, still. The Jamwa shawl, when the family possesses a Jamwa shawl, and the telephone. Now, telephone can be only possessed in 90s especially. It was a very real luxury. Today, everyone might have a mobile phone, but even the mobile phone, as the COVID has taught us, is a luxury of a certain class. A lot of people cannot afford it. Okay? But in 90s, it was more so. If you see this popular serial that used to come in 90s by the late comedian Jaspal Bhatti, it has a special issue on this, special episode on when the family gets a landline installed. And you can see how the whole colony gathers at his house to congratulate him on the achievement of having a landline, installed. So, and the cosmopolitanism of the reading list. You have Iqbal, you have Lorca, you have Raiki, Kawafi, Europeans, you have Iqbal, Urdu, Lorca, Spanish, Amichai, Israeli, Paz, October Paz, the Argentinian poet, and you see what a great the diversity of reading it is available. And as you have studied in your coursework that culture, especially canon, is a product of a class position. Right? This diversity of reading, this cosmopolitanism, is not natural. This cosmopolitanism is a privilege of his class. Right? So the brocade worn by the photographed couple. Photography was during that time an expensive luxury. Now today you can click a photo by a cell phone, but then you had to have that camera and you had to have the film. Most of you would not have lived in the age of film, but I who have lived in the age of film, I know you would very carefully, take a photograph. You would go to a photographer and hire a photographer to click your picture, and it used to come in 5-6 days, unlike today when you can print it out. So, are sufficient indicators of Shahid's class. His gesture to nullify colonialism by blank stamps which stamp out the seals. Now, stamp is a pun. One is stamp, a postage stamp, and the stamp can also be a stamp, the seal, which you can, which indicates authority of a gazetted officer, the government. Okay? So therefore, it's rooted in a nostalgia for this privilege, even though it's employed as a counter-colonial instrument. So this seepage of class consciousness informs Shahid's lament for Kashmir. What he missed for and foremost, what he mourns for, is this old elite bonhomie, the class that could have this luxury. And that is why Shahid was never comfortable with militancy. Okay? As he makes very amply clear in A Country Without a Post Office, he's not very comfortable with the movement at all, the movement that rose, the rebellion that rose in Kashmir. In poems like The Correspondent, he is quite uncomfortable with it. Why? Because it challenged the old class boundaries. Because when everyone, when the militancy rose, it defied the traditional hierarchies. Now you could have a person from Dar as a commander of a person who was a Pirzada. Okay? So what it challenged first was the old class boundaries, and therefore disvalues the old cultural wealth, because when the gun becomes the symbol of power, culture automatically takes a back seat. And that is what Shahid is most concerned about. It disvalues the old cultural wealth so dear to Shahid and his family. So, especially when the world order envisioned by militancy, it was premised primarily upon Sunni Islamic imaginaries. Now, Shahid's family, his mother was at least from the Shiite background. His father was from the Shiite background. Okay? So he finds the Sunni Islamic imaginary has absolutely no use or respect for this old cultural Muslim elite. Right? It has no use for Kawafi. It has no use for Jami. It has no use for these things. Right? So what he misses first and foremost, his Kashmir is this Kashmir of this class. Now, I'm not saying that Shahid's poetry is not a means of archiving the conflict, or not saying that poetry is not employed against the state, but simply to acknowledge that, like every author, he is product of a particular historical force and circumstance over which he could exert little control, and over the work that emerged from it. I'll just give you one more example, which I have not present in the slides, and then I'll end my talk. Take a look at Shahid's use of Rizwan. Shahid uses this figure of Rizwan as a symbol of the lost Kashmiri youth. The Kashmiri youth who were shot dead either became militants or were dead. And Rizwan is his name for the figure that he mourns. Right? That becomes a symbol of the victimized Kashmiri. My point is, why Rizwan? Why not any other name? Now, Rizwan is first a scriptural name. Rizwan is the name of the guardian of the paradise, one of the guardians of paradise. If you believe in Islam, Quran says that Rizwan guards the heaven. Right? He is the gatekeeper. So one Rizwan is a scriptural authority, scriptural name. And who could access the scriptures? Still in Kashmir, a lot of people cannot access the scriptures. The scriptures are in Arabic, which are not the native tongue. So it is fell upon the class, the clergy, to explain it to Muslims. Right? So when Shahid talks about Rizwan, he's talking about Rizwan is because he represents the power of scripture. B. Rizwan is also the name of the son of Maulvi Hai, who was the preacher, chief imam at Jama Masjid, Srinagar, which has had historically great importance in the history of Kashmir. I'll not go into the details now. If you're interested, you can read that up. But Maulvi Hai's son Rizwan picked up arms, went across the border for arms training, and perished on the way. In the mountains, there was an encounter with the army, with the BSF, and he perished, and his body was not found. And his father established a college in his son's memory, a B.Ed college. It exists today, just 10 minutes from my ancestral home. Rizwan College of Education. Now, my Shahid is saying Rizwan. So he is reifying the who could be named, who could be remembered. Only Rizwan could be remembered because his father had the class and the culture, educational growth, cultural capital, and monetary capital to establish a college, to make an intervention in pedagogy. So it was only because of this intervention that Rizwan could be immortalized. So when Shahid is mourning for Rizwan, he is mourning the death of a certain and specific class. His Kashmir is rooted in this class imagination. Rizwan comes to him only because Rizwan is someone who is familiar to him. And who is familiar to him? A person of his own class. Shahid's idea of Kashmir, therefore, tells us that Kashmir, when you think of a counter movement, Kashmir exists differently in the minds of different people. Right? Even those who think of a counter to the state, they also are not motivated by a single impulse, but their politics and their writings are greatly modified and determined by their class, by their culture, and by their politics. I think that is what my point was, to show that this resistance, when the counter movement itself cannot be plotted along a single line, then how can the state's imposition, which it emerges as an opposition to, therefore hold truth? So therefore, by questioning its own contradictions, by questioning the contradictions of those who resist the state, what we are pointing out is that all narratives are fundamentally, all linear narratives are fundamentally erroneous and therefore need to be abolished in favor of a narrative which is both pluralistic and multiple. Thank you. I think I'll end here, otherwise it will go on. Thank you.
Okay. So it's been truly a fascinating experience for all of us. Thank you so much for the enlightening words. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
Now, I'd like to inform you that the session is now open for a live interaction. Anjana ma'am will coordinate you with the details. Ma'am, please.
Now the paper is open for discussion. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can even post it in the chat box.
So many people, not a single question. Was it so bad?
Sir, can I ask something?
Yeah, sure, Lakshmi, go ahead.
It was really a very informative session on resistance poetry. Sir, being yourself a writer, a poet, what are the challenges that you face? Do you feel any a lack of freedom when you write about the pertinent issues that affect your locality?
That's a question I was hoping to avoid, but nonetheless, I'll give you an answer to that. It's self-evident, of course, that one does feel the various pulls and pressures. If you look at in one of my poems, I did say the very same. Quote to you that line that I wrote once in my last book. I'll quote you the line. I think that will answer the question itself. Uh, Give me a second. I'll tell you. Yes, here. It says that my mother is so grateful. I'm safe and alive. I'm her world and her afterworld. I must not argue about Kashmir. I must keep safe. She suspects my poems are unsafe and wants them shipped to her without delay. That explains it all to you. When you write, uh, of course, there are multiple pulls and pressures that you're wise enough to understand. And yes, one writes despite of them because one cannot help it. One is bound by one's emotions. But yes, there are pulls and pressures, and they do exist. What can you do about that? Uh, in my area, in the country as a whole, in the world as a whole, you cannot escape those pulls and pressures. Sorry, I cannot go into more detail for this question.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for.
So, there are a few
Dr. Hussain.
questions in the chat box.
Yeah. Ma'am, shall I read it out?
Okay. Shambhu, there are a few questions, one or two questions in the chat box.
So once again, thank you, Huzaifa, for the wonderful lecture. So there are some questions in the chat box. I'll read them out one by one. The first is by a colleague of mine, Dr. Sita Vijay Kumar. This is what she wrote. Thank you so much for enlightening us on the nature and cause of resistance poetry. You explained how poetry is not just the result of tranquility, pleasure, or aesthetics, but it is the result of resistance, survival, or the very act of living every single day. My question would be how, as a writer or academician, you, as somebody who hails from Kashmir, resist or chronicle your experience for the rest of India. I meant your personal ways of voice.
Well, there are multiple ways, but since you asked as writer, I'll explain both the things. First, I'll talk about academician. Uh, as an academician, this was a question that was even asked during my interview. PhD interview. They asked me the same question. To that, the answer is that you talk to the students when you are teaching, or when you are teaching in the class. You try to orient the lecture, or you try to orient the class to a such a way that the student becomes aware that what he takes or she takes for granted, the concepts, for example, of movement, the question of azadi, the question of oppression, uh, you know or the questions of the state liberation. These are not questions that are facts set in stone, or the very other questions. These are concepts and terms that have come due to specific historical exigencies, due to specific pulls and pressures, and therefore it is imperative that they recognize that these ideas can be challenged and must be challenged in order for Kashmir, or for other places, for the country to become a more divergent and accepting state. Second, as an academician, that is as my teacher, but also one, for example, a large corpus of my academic writing is devoted to Kashmir. For example, one of my recent papers was translating loss, translation as resistance poetry. A talk I also gave recently at IFLU, for IFLU. that paper talks about how how Urdu poems written for entirely different audiences and entirely different people can be used to appropriate and can be used translated to accentuate and foreground the lived realities and lived histories of Kashmir. So that is how one can do. Then you ask, that is the academician. The second was as a writer. So as a writer, as Faz said, हम परवरिश लोह कलम करते रहेंगे, जो दिल पे गुजरती है वो रकम करते रहेंगे, एक तर्ज तगाफुल सो उनको मुबारक, एक अर्ज तमन्ना है सो हम करते रहेंगे. We'll continue to nourish the slate and the pen. Whatever befalls the heart, will continue to record. If it's destined, it is their habit to ignore. एक तर्ज तगाफुल है सो वो करते रहेंगे. They will not listen, but एक अर्ज तमन्ना है सो हम करते रहेंगे. We'll continue to express what we feel and what we desire. So my whole poetry, this is a joke I keep cracking. A lot of people ask, why don't you write love poetry? My fiance is in this chat box. She said, why don't you write love poetry? My answer is, it doesn't come. Love poetry, I wish I could write it. I wish I could write about love poetry, a common theme. Wish I could write about boredom. I wish I could write about the city and other things, but it simply doesn't come. Every poem, everything that I write or have written, somehow or the other, comes back to the same question of fragility of memory and fragility of this, this continuous fear and continuous anger, this vacillation between the two states. So, whatever I have written in poetry, whatever I have translated, for example, my last book was titled Green is the Color of Memory. So, again, you see what am I highlighting? Memory, the permanence of memory. That memory forever remains green. The wound never heals. So I think as a writer, what I do is, or what I have done is that I try to write poems and I try to write even essays. For example, recently I published an essay in Outlook, a nostalgia's map of Kashmir, in which I talked about my childhood growing up in, the peak of militancy. So I think that's how I can do it. Does that answer the question, Sita ma'am?
Yes, sir. Shall I ask one question, please?
Yes, please. There's Manish's question too.
Okay, sir.
Yes, please ask. Then I'll address Manish's
Yes, sir.
question.
Thank you very much for the answers straight from your heart. And what you have given, you have, as you have said in an interview, you haven't taken any sides. You are keeping away from being a propagandist. That's fine. That's well and good. And from your lecture, it was very clear that you are an ardent fan of Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet. And I hope that I tell myself a moon will rise from my darkness. Thank you, sir.
Manish has a question. Should I read it?
No, I will read it out. So this is by Manish Solanki. So even if Shahid's poetry is beset by unitary class affiliations, as you mentioned, won't it still be desirable compared to statist hegemony in terms of its resistance potentials?
Of course, that is not disputed. I never disputed. The very fact that I clubbed Agha Shahid Ali under the category of a resistance poet validates your assertion that it is desirable. The fact that Shahid has contradictions, I could not get the time. It would have been, it would have taken a lot more time and space to talk about it. But when the paper comes, on which this lecture is based, it will come in the Kashmiri critical handbook of Kashmir studies. If you read that paper, you will point out that I agree entirely with you. My point is, in fact, was this, that it is better to have, contradictions. It's better to have a poetry. Shahid's poetry is important to us because it points out to us that even as the counter has contradictions, that it counters while as it does counter status hegemony, it's beset by its own contradictions, but that's better, because why should you have singular ideas? Why should you have singular concepts? Yes, Shahid was after all a poet of his, you cannot escape your upbringing. I was not critiquing, pointing out or trying to cancel out Shahid's poetry. My whole problem is this uncritical celebration of Agha Shahid Ali as a poet of one only who has given voice to Kashmir. It comes specifically from an irritation with this, what do you say, canonization in the Christian sense of Agha Shahid Ali as making him this saint patron of Kashmir. My point was solely to point out that Shahid's poetry is, yes, it is very beautiful, that yes, it does talk about Kashmir, but also Shahid's poetry talks about a specific section of Kashmir. It is limited by his own experience, and at that very time, that is its strength. It might be its weakness, but that is its strength too, because it points out to you that even those whom you venerate as counters to the state have their own fallibility and have their own, limitations. And that points out to you that, that ideas are not, some things that are cast in stone or that are fixed. Ideas need to be challenged. We need to move beyond deification of persons or personalities, or even deification of ideas. One should always be prepared to have and listen to and accept that there will be an counter to your argument, or your poet, or your leader, or whatever, whomever you idolize, even maybe your God, for that matter of speaking. So that was the whole point. It was not to argue that it is not desirable. Of course it's desirable, and you cannot escape your class status. Whatever you do, for example, the fact that I'm able to talk here to you is a testimony to my class. I was educated in an English medium school. I attended university. I attended college. I have the luxury of having internet. I have a job. Therefore, I could prepare for this lecture. I have internet. I have a laptop. All these are class symbols. So while as I'm talking about class, I know that I am also included in the same class, and most of us will be included in the same class. That was my whole point. I think, does that answer your question, Manish? Okay, Manish is not here, but I think.
So you just commented.
Okay, he did.
Yes, sir.
Shambhu, if there are no more questions, shall we wind up?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, some more questions are there.
Yeah, what?
No, I think that was the last question.
Okay, I think there's something. Someone raised a hand. I think someone raised a hand or something. I think I did see.
Megha, Santosh. I mean, if you have a question, you can either.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I have a question, sir. But it is not so much or very much related to Agha Shahid Ali or his poems, but something related to Kashmiri literature in general. So, how far